thank you for coming. And we are now panel number 3. For those of you that have been to the previous panels, we are ACID. I never, ever thought I'd be asked to host a panel called ACID. But there we go. In my terms, as a farmer, ACID would mean probably a peat soil, certainly not a clay soil, which is alkaline. And that's about the best I can give you on acid, and I'm sure the panel will have more, but we'll perhaps leave that one. So we're not going to talk a lot about acid. Right, so we're going to head straight into trying to give you information that will help you understand, and it's hard enough trying to get it right ourselves, but what is the difference between the different farming food produce that you receive at a restaurant or buy through direct online as a consumer, or that you buy in a supermarket. And we started by calling it organic or regenerative. And as I reflected on that, I was thinking, well, actually, you can't talk about those two without taking the whole spectrum of how we grow our produce, which I would say starts at the highest level with biodynamic, then organic, then regenerative, then conventional, and perhaps somewhere out in Mars is GMO. So you've got those, or GM product, those areas. So we're going to try and distill that for you with the panel and try and understand what that might mean. But before we start, can I just ask, how many farmers or producers have we got in the audience? 1. Great, that makes our life a lot easier.
We can say one.
So what I'd like to do then is ask my panel to introduce themselves. So perhaps, Alice, if we can start with you at the far end.
Sure. Hello, I'm Alice. So I'm a nutritionist, but I actually started my career in medicine. So worked as a doctor in the NHS for many years before doing a master in nutrition, just basically seeing, the health crisis and being on first-hand witnessing all these diet-related disease. I just was like, nutrition is the answer. So then I went and wanted to pursue studying that further. So I did that. And now I've kind of stepped away from clinical medicine and I work as a nutritionist at Yo Valley. I also do a bit of freelance work on the side, but essentially a public health nutritionist.
Hello, I'm Will. I'm also with Yo Valley, but I'm very much a farmer and spend my days out in fields and digging holes. I suppose I've spent the last 5 years down various different rabbit holes of farming systems and looking at how we could develop our own regenerative organic farming system to deliver multiple benefits, and importantly, sort of linking up with Alice in terms of the health of the products, but also that wider ecosystem effect and delivering public goods.
Hi, so I'm Liam. I work for a restaurant group up in Cumbria that is serviced by our farm. So I'm chef first, grower second, so I'm still very much learning the growing side, but bringing that link between, food and where it comes from is really important for me and, for our guests.
I'm Alice, also a chef. So
So hang on, I'm just going to interrupt. Your power,
Yes.
your mayor. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I might address them as power mayor.
strong surnames both. Yeah.
Strong surname.
So I'm a head chef at a restaurant called the Black Swan in Alstead, that's in North Yorkshire, and we are very lucky to be the sort of beneficiaries of the Banks family, who have a 170-acre farm and also a 2-acre kitchen garden that supplies our restaurants, but also the other restaurants that are within our group itself. And they moved from kind of generations past of intensive arable farming before they had the restaurant to now having a much more regenerative approach. It's still developing, but that supplies our restaurants.
My name is David. I currently work with the Newton Somerset. I started out wanting to be outside as a teenager and followed it through to a degree in commercial horticulture, where they taught me all of the wonderful ways of growing food with chemicals. Several years later, I discovered that my staff didn't want to eat the food that we were growing. So I advanced, I became an organic farmer and then a biodynamic farmer, and then all the way through to having my own farm with dairy and 100 acres all down to New York City, all the way back to the UK, where I now have found a lovely place here at the Newton Somerset, where we grow about 12 acres of row crops outside, polytunnel crops, glasshouse crops, mostly for consumption in our 5 restaurants, but also available through our e-commerce business. And although we're not certified, we do follow the biodynamic principles on the productive growing side of things.
Hi, I'm Debbie. I'm the founder of Wild Wine School. So we're a wine school that specialises in sustainability in wine. I, through wine, kind of did lots of exploration of different farming or agricultural practices and eventually realised that lots of the things wrong with the wine industry actually kind of are much wider issues within our kind of food systems. And from that then have spent lots more time looking into that, and also started teaching and doing workshops around that as well.
So I'm Roger Saul. My background is I founded and grew the Mulberry fashion business around the world, design, manufacture, wholesale, retail, and finally direct to consumer, across a wide range of products, which gave me a huge touch to what happens with margins and currency across the world, which very much affects how we import and export and cost of goods. I then opened a hotel called Charlton House, and we got a Michelin star in our first year, which I'm quite sure we didn't really deserve, but we kept it for 9 years somehow or another. And then from there, during that process, understanding how to run a restaurant and how you bought your food and food margins, we bought the farm around our house, Sharpen Park, and decided to go organic, and then thought, okay, I also had a designer outlet village called Kilver Court, which is in Shepton Mallet. And so we started feeding from the farm organically through butchery and food shop and restaurant at Kilver Court and the restaurant at Charlton House, and discovered the immense problems of, okay, I've got 1 cow, 10 cows, how do I get that to the butchery? Oh, I've got too many, and how do you do nose to tail? And is the chef interested anyway? Because all he's interested in is beautiful food on the plate. So that was a very, very formative period of change. Then ended up growing spelt, and then built a flour mill to process that spelt, and then turned that into finished product, from cereals through to finally a spelt milk. Got blown away with margin post-COVID and closed that down quietly, successfully, but sadly. But during that period beforehand, we had planted 300 walnut trees back 20 years ago, thinking we'd have masses of walnuts in a few years. 20 years later, we finally will have a big crop this year, and we started cropping 2 days ago, and we'll finish in 2 weeks' time. And we're the only British organic walnut producer in the country. So that's me, and we will try and give you the best we can on the subject matter, which is how you produce and farm the different regimes. So let's start with biodynamic, or biodynamique, as it's called in Europe typically. It's much stronger in Europe than here. The States, I'm less sure, David, but come back to that. But Debbie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So biodynamics is a method of farming that's based on the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. So he gave some lectures to farmers in 1924. Lots of people associate it with cow horns and the moon. So biodynamics is a farming system that sees the farm as a whole. So they call it the farm organism. And it's about the holistic health of that organism, so everything together, and that includes the farmer. Sorry, I shouldn't point at myself, I'm not a farmer, but the farmer themselves is part of that farm organism. So it involves applying preparations, so there are spray preparations and compost preparations. Some of those are prepared in cow horns, so there's horn manure and also horn silica. And there's also compost preparations. Another element to biodynamics is growing by the cycles of the moon. So they split the calendar into fruit days, leaf days, root days, and flower days. And so different kind of work in the farm happens on each of those days. And I think, David, do you want to kind of bring any more?
I can bring some more to that. So often I get asked, as a kind of guest-facing experience, why would you do these somewhat obscure activities? Where is any science behind it? And I often refer to the concept of when you're not stood in a church graveyard, you feel one way. When you step over into the church graveyard, you experience something else. Now that something else we don't really measure, but there's definitely something there. When you start to kind of bundle that up, when you start to accentuate it, when you amplify it, you end up with perhaps wine that is totally spectacular, or beef that is totally bizarrely good, or crops that are expressing themselves in different ways. So why would you be a biodynamic grower if there's no sense or science behind it, or proven science behind it, yet collectively we can all appreciate what the differences might be?
I mean, I'm very much from the organic perspective and regenerative organic, but I think from that rabbit hole of farming systems, these sort of labels are fantastic in understanding what goes into it, but actually almost restrictive in your potential of your own farming system. So I've looked at plenty of biodynamics. I look at conventional farming too, because there's some really amazing technology there, but is it used for the wrong application? Absolutely. Could we harness it in an organic system? Potentially. So but I think the biggest thing that I took from the biodynamics movement is observation, being observant of your land and your ecosystem, and what is it telling you? If a plant is going to seed when it shouldn't be, it's stressed, so perhaps you're doing something wrong. And I think that's a really powerful from a farmer's perspective, and we've really lost that in agriculture.
I'm going to add a tiny little bit. I tried biodynamic because I was going into organic, so best part of 20 years ago. And the head of the biodynamic organisation in the UK at that time was in Wales, charming man. And he was 3 hours late for his appointment, which I thought, what's going on here? And he came in and said, look, I'm really sorry. I couldn't come to you earlier because my cows weren't happy. And they wanted me to be with them at that moment, and then I had to come late. So we were sort of scratching our heads and thinking, this is crazy. But I think the sentiment was, for him, his most important things were his cows and how were they and what they were doing. I was secondary at that point. And it sounds a silly statement, but actually as I've gone on in life, I've actually sort of half valued that. We then did try doing it. We were ploughing by the moonlight and doing all those different things that you do with biodynamic. And I had cows with horns, White Park cattle, and I did dehorn them and use them and stuck them in the manure. But finally my farm team, here, Raj, you can't do that, or you're not going to do that. And that was the end of it, because they just couldn't understand what I was doing. Not that I could understand either. But I do think that thing, most of it is based on agricultural methods that go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And as you said, Will, watching exactly what the soil is doing, what the seeds are doing. So I think it's probably ultimately underneath it all the most important of everything. But panel, just going back, how do we sell that to the audience? What is it about biodynamic that says if you read that on the product, why would you buy that? Is it the sentiment we just expressed, or is it something more than that?
So I think with that, a broader, biodynamic, regenerative, it just shows more care. Right? People are giving more care into what they do, and that shows in the final product. If you care about what you do and you take time and do things the right way, then that shows in the final product. Ultimately, in my world, it's flavour. On the base level. If you take more care of something, it tastes better. If you start that in the growing stages, by the time you get it in the kitchen, you have to do very little with it. So, taking more care.
Yeah, so I think the sentiment is there. Behind that, would I be right in saying that no chemicals are involved in the biodynamic process?
In the organic production, you have the OMRI list, so the Organic Materials Research Institute, that lists all of the different things that you may or may not use in organic production. And in the biodynamic presentation, there is still a list, but it's
Very limited.
incredibly limited. And it makes a producer really think about, well, if the problem is this, why do I have that problem? And then on that farming as a whole kind of concept, how might I farm differently so I don't re-encounter that same problem and be tempted to use any of those either OMRI listed or government listed approved chemicals on those crops?
So we'll head on to organic next, but I think behind organic, in my view, and I think the panel's view, biodynamic sits a sort of king above that in terms of caring for the food produce you're producing for your consumer. So let's head into organic next. Let's start, Will, with you.
Well, if you go right back to its conception, it was Eve Balfour's first book, and I can't remember the dates, and don't ask me for numbers because I'm very dyslexic, but she wrote a fantastic book all about rotational farming and farming with nature, and a really important part of that was soil. As an organic farmer, my only asset and my most important thing is my soil, my stock, and sort of the available nutrients around. So we're not, we sort of often summarize it as soil not oil, and that's how we produce food.
I think that if we think about our senses, so we have taste and sight and touch and sound and smell, that fits nicely in a box. Then when we start to think outside of that, and what does the farmer experience when they go into their soils, it doesn't even have to be barefoot. They can stick their hands in, they can see the expression of the cows or whatever's grazing through there, and they can see how that sunshine is being turned into the nutrition cycle for all of what we're eating collectively, I think we can really start to see the sense in it.
Under organic, there is a certification process that means we have two bodies in the UK, the Organic Farmers and Growers and the Soil Association. And those bodies, you pay to be a part of those organisations, and they come and certify you, which means they go through every single bit of paperwork that you've had to produce in terms of where you buy your seed from, it has to be organic seed, where you bought your cattle from, and the process, it takes 18 months to 2 years to become organic, and that process, you're in conversion to get there. So if you're a conventional farmer and you want to go organic, you have to go through that process, and you can't sell your product as organic until you finish that process. So it's a fairly exacting, and I remember I'd come out of Mulberry and started organic farming, and I'd made great friends with the Soil Association, and because I had a marketing background, I think they were quite keen I joined them. I then had my first inspection, and it was brutal, absolutely brutal. They came through like a sort of police operation. Where did that deer come from? Why has it not got horns on it? It was really horrific. And I said the next day to Patrick Holden, who was then chairman of the Soil Association, came with his marketing team to the farm by chance the day after, and we were sort of still shell-shocked from the day before. And he said that shouldn't have happened. And of course, they have the policing side, which is literally they must police it correctly so that you, consumer, can be 100% certain that we haven't put any antibiotics, any fertilizers, any chemicals, any pesticides into the process. And I think Monty, my wife, who's with us today, will remember we were just going through this process, and we had a lovely farm manager who came in, and we had 1 or 2 gigantic 25-acre fields where we planted wheat or spelt or whatever it might have been. He came in at the end of the day, and in conversion, we had been advised to take half the farm into organic and keep half conventional, and just see whether that was something we wanted to do. And so we did that, thinking, well, why don't we just go in completely? I'm so glad we did that, because it meant we watched for the first time how conventional farming worked. This farmer was a wheat farmer, very good at his job. He was expect to see 4 to 5 tons per acre for wheat. It was hedge to hedge and act like a carpet. And then I'd got my organic, or in conversion, organic field of spelt next door. And there it was growing up. And spelt, we'd had dairy farm for 30 years before that, so it was really, really positive land. And up came the wheat like a carpet, not a blade out of position. Up came my spelt, and it was like a jungle. Nettles, weeds, flowers, everything growing in it. But the spelt grew up through it to nearly 6 feet tall. It wouldn't normally, but there's an enormous amount of cow manure in there. So that was hugely inspirational. I remember Monty saying to the farmer, what do you put on the wheat to sort of control it? How does it look like a carpet there, and we've got this jungle over here? Oh, nothing to be worried about. DEFRA got rid of all the nasties years ago. This is 2003. And you think of the nasties that are still out there today. So he had sprayed, the seed had been sprayed before it had gone on the ground with a pesticide. The seed had come up, he had fertilized it. The seed got a bit bigger. He then put on a growth inhibitor, which meant it wouldn't grow more than 18 inches tall or 15 inches, so the combine could go over it easily. In our conversion field, we've got a 4 meter or 6 meter margin for the deer and the insects and everything to move it up and down and around the field. Nothing on the conventional edge to edge. He then sprayed pesticide, insecticide, herbicide, you name it, went on that crop. It looked perfect, but the amount of chemicals there, and we were then invited up to visit Prince Charles at Highgrove, and the farm manager took us round there. And he had just come from somewhere else, a big conventional farm, and he took us around and he said, now look at this bean field. It's perfect. Now, in my old farming days, I would have looked at it now, I'd have seen the black fly coming in, I'd have called up, and in would come the crop sprayer, would have sprayed that crop, and the black fly would have gone. Yes. However, I now watched it with absolute horror. The black fly were invading, but then in came the ladybirds and ate the black fly, and everything was fine. I'm sure it doesn't work that way all the time, but in fact, I know it doesn't. But the principle was, what I'm trying to give you is that the difference between organic and the controlling of organic, of what you can use in chemicals and fertilizers and pesticides and so on, Roundup, etc., you cannot use it. So I think for me the biggest endorsement of organic is that apart from the fact that you're doing, I would suggest, most of what the biodynamic side is saying, you're looking, you're caring, you're looking at your soil, you have to, because you can't add the fertilizers, you can't, you've got to use natural materials. So unless you move your fields round, we were doing a crop rotation with our spelt of a 4-year cycle where we'd do 1 year spelt, 2nd year spelt, and would then put in a clover mix to fix the nitrogen, which meant that then we could go back to that field in a further 2 years and reuse it. With our sheep, we couldn't, if we got a problem, we couldn't do anything. The same with the deer, with the white part cattle, the same. So you really had to move your animals around, rotation, to make it all work. And that would then manure the land and so on. So to me, that, I think, with what the panel have said, sums up organic. Now, let's head to the next one. We're starting to get exciting now. Conventional. Who would like to pick that up first?
I suppose the big thing about conventional is it's very much, it hasn't been a choice. It's been, as everyone sort of nodded their heads if they've heard of the Green Revolution after the war, a few nodding heads out there. So it's essentially, when we came out of the war, we had to feed people. What happened with that is all the horrible sort of chemistry that was discovered throughout the war. Essentially, basically we got fertilizer, and that was sort of the first cornerstone of conventional agriculture. After fertilizer came in, that sort of destroyed soil health. So we started to have lots more weeds. When your soil's not thriving and healthy, it's almost like when you go to a park and it's been a really rough summer, some people have been like, or a party or something, whatever, you'll have lots of weeds coming up afterwards when it's poor soil health. Then we invented a herbicide to get rid of the weeds coming up through. And then as soon as we invented the herbicide, that killed pollinations and other abilities. So then you invented an insecticide. So essentially we came up with a suite of chemistry, a big chemistry set in order to kill, essentially. So everything that we've kind of been talking about to start off with is all about life. It's all about supporting an ecosystem and almost harvesting food off of that ecosystem. But then in conventional agriculture, it's ever so very different. But the really big caveat I'd really like to say about that is that hasn't been sort of by the fault of the farmer. It's also been driven by economics. As a country, we are determined to have cheap food and high yields. And essentially, that's exactly what conventional farming delivers. I suppose where we're sat, hopefully on this panel, is how can we make that change? How can we see the wider benefits of working with ecosystems? And I'm sure we'll go into nutrient density and biodiversity and soil carbon and the other benefits.
Thank you, Will. That was really helpful. And I think Will's main point, that this wasn't farmers just trying to get a better yield. This was about the whole way farming went, and they didn't know differently. And I think the biggest problem we've got is how do we move forward from that? And I've almost reversed this on purpose by accident, that regenerative should have come before that. But it hasn't. It's probably quite a good thing it hasn't. So where does regenerative fit in that? Well, I first came across it. We were doing a press jolly at the farm a couple of years ago. And it was just coming up, and Wild Farmed, who many of you will have heard of as a brand, cereal-based, have done a brilliant job in marketing regenerative farming in the UK. It's really, I guess, panel, would you agree, come out of the States as a movement and then come to us over here. So it is now thriving. When I asked all of these different shopkeepers or press what they thought organic meant, they sort of said a bit of what we said, but didn't really fully understand it, but they thought it was good. I then asked what regenerative was. Oh, yes, it's great. But they hadn't a clue what it meant. And I think there's a great example in our wonderful country and world that when something gets cool, everybody gets behind it and it becomes the new best thing to do. But we don't often don't fully understand what it is that's cool about it, other than some cool guys projecting it. So let's now run into what regenerative really does mean, because there are a vast spectrum of understandings, methods, and things. I think the thing to start with is there is no official, I might be a little bit wrong, there might just be starting to be a certification process in the UK that would mean that you, the consumer, would be able to know what regenerative actually contained and meant for you in buying your product. But let's start, I think Debbie's got quite strong feelings about it, so do you want to start off this time?
Sure. I think that, like you say, the regenerative movement has been a huge force for good globally and in the UK. And what's really nice about it is that it's a toolkit that you can apply to any farming system. You can make very small changes that can have really good effects on the health of the whole ecosystem and the soil. There's 5 pillars of regenerative farming. So keeping cover on the soil, bringing in animals, someone might have to help me in a minute, making sure that there's roots in the soil throughout the year, bringing as much diversity as possible. But I think one of the kind of drawbacks here, or it's kind of like a double-edged sword, is that one issue is that with a lot of that marketing is the danger of greenwashing. And so there are some producers, we're seeing people like McDonald's, Nestle, Pepsi talking about regenerative farming and their commitments to it, but without committing to any certification. And so people can be kind of picking little bits from this toolkit and certainly improving on what they're doing. But at the same time, because as consumers, we're not necessarily always sure how that compares to like organics or biodynamics or something else. People are maybe thinking that they're going beyond when often they're not. But that's not to say, there is a certification called regenerative organic, where organic is the baseline. And my personal opinion is that regenerative should be organic plus.
So I also think that there's a tremendous amount of good work being done by both wild farmed and also regenerative agriculture, even if it's just the concept that us all as consumers have the idea that the farmers collectively have the intent to give back to the ground or allow their farms to grow more than they're taking from it. However, it does get a lot tangled in the idea as to what can they do versus what they can't do, what's the right way, what's the wrong way to harvest all of that sunshine and turn it into more than they started out with for future generations.
Let's put you on the spot, David. The nude. Regenerative farming.
So the newt is an interesting, of course, little insect or little animal in that we will not certify in anything because of the constraint that it would put on any of the activities that we might do. So in my heart, I'm a biodynamic/organic farmer. On our wider estate, we do practice regenerative farming, and the head farmer there, Cameron, he says that we have about 250 acres this year into cover crop. So we have a certain amount of our lands is being turned back into regenerative agriculture. The rest of the ground we are, of course, dependent on yield, just like everybody else. So we're harvesting and doing the best practices that we possibly can by today's common understanding.
So in your case, you'd be saying, trust my brand.
I'm saying that we are all actually choosing with what we buy when, and we're all, thanks to technology today, we can research to the levels that we would like to know how those things are produced. Can we meet the person that grew those things that we're eating? And in the newt's perspective, we welcome education. We would like to educate everybody that we can in what we're doing and how we're doing it.
Power, Alice.
Power, Alice. So if I share the kind of particular experience on behalf of the Banks family, I was lucky enough this week just to sit down with, I might call them AB and TB, that's Anne Banks and Tom Banks. We call them that because also then there's son Tommy who runs the restaurant, it is called Tommy. So AB and TB. TB's family have been farming in the area where we are, in that North Yorkshire area, for 100 years plus, basically, and for a lot of that time was in that conventional style. And I think he would be a kind of a good example that you would see lots of UK farmers going through, where they farmed very conventionally, took on all this information and advice from agronomists and what you should be doing, and taking on fertilizers and treating the land as they were kind of advised to improve yield and reduce pests and weeds and things like that. But the kind of proof was in the pudding, in that about 10 to 20 years ago, they just started to see that the soil itself was depleted, and you can kind of read that in how the land responds to you. And that then starts to disconnect, because you think, well, how is all of this helping, and yet I'm being left with a worse product and a worse source for me to kind of work with. So after essentially mining the soil, which is what it is, you're just kind of taking and taking and taking, and being quite reactive then to fix problems rather than preventative, which I think comes from that regenerative and biodynamic side of things, called it quits on that approach and wanted to change it. I think it's like with anything, if you try and kind of put a label on something, it is helpful because people can trust that brand, organic, people know what they're getting. But most of these things are kind of broader umbrella things. If someone was to say to you, this is an artisanal cheese, we all roughly know what artisanal maybe implies, but I don't know, and to be corrected, that is like a defined thing. So at the minute, regenerative is in that kind of sense. You get an idea of what someone's thoughts are and values and how they've approached the task, but there is nothing that demonstrates, they've done this. You just believe that it is a better quality product as a result of it. I think defining things can be helpful for the consumers and for kind of moving practices along. But I'm also conscious, I think a lot of the people that within the farming community, there is that tension always with it. Is it too restrictive? Does it mean that we can't kind of work with what we have? And does it maybe inhibit people from taking those initial steps? I think 80% of an improved way of farming is also good, even if you're not at 100%. It's trying to kind of move practices on and applaud and support good work in that direction, even if it will not kind of finally tick a box that means you can print it on a label or I can print it on a menu. Or, I think there's always that tension with defining things.
Do you practice the same in your restaurant as you do in your personal life? Very personal question.
In what sense? In what you would buy. Choices of buying. Yes, I'm very lucky that I'm kind of well fed through work, and as a chef, we might share, you don't tend to do a lot of eating outside of work sometimes, funnily enough. So I try my very best. I'm lucky to have access to the kind of the farm and bits and pieces. I buy organic, and that's my kind of one step towards it. But I'm like any other normal consumer, I bump into bad habits as well.
Yeah, well, just to pick up on like what David said, so we also take bits from each organic practices, biodynamic practices, but again, to apply for those certifications, like David said, it restricts what we can do. We just rely on people to trust us that we're doing the right thing, and I think that comes down to like what you said about the brand. Like, we're very open about what we do, and we'll show people around the farm, it's an open door policy. Anyone who dines in restaurants can come and see what we do and how we do it. And I think going back to that, that the definition of regenerative is working with nature rather than against it. That's what it boils down to. That's how I was explaining, and that's how I, in my simple mind, understand that, like we said about the conventional farming is very much against nature and preventing nature, whereas regenerative farming is very much allowing nature to do what nature does.
Alice and Liam, as chefs, do you present on your menus where your food comes from, or whether it's organic, regenerative, or...?
Because we are not 100% sustained by ourselves, we don't necessarily say that everything has come from where we are, but a vast majority of what we do is coming from in the last 5 years, the family moved into breeding and rearing our own animals to supply the restaurants, but also then, as I say, we have that farm. So ours is more of a conversation with the guest through our storytelling. I feel like storytelling and emotion has been mentioned a lot in all the panels today, but that is our kind of major tool before the guest arrives to us, but also when they're dining with us to tell them a bit about it. Similar to Liam's, it is open for people to come and see. We do garden tours. They're able to go and see the farm. They go out with our foraging team as well to see that aspect of our business. So it's a bit more of that conversation. It's less a kind of a neat sentence.
Do you think there's a responsibility, if you like, we are direct responsible, aren't we, when we go into a supermarket or into a shop and we make a choice or we buy online? Do you think restaurants need to take more care? Because I know I'm pretty hopeless when I go to a restaurant. I look at what it is because I'm looking at taste and creativity. I don't look for organic, or even though I'm an organic farmer. Do you think restaurants have more responsibility, or do you think it's just one of those things that's shot by on the outside lane?
Any industry, the industry leaders set the tone. I hate to use the term trends, but if you take fashion, for instance, and I'm trying to about your toes here, but the fashion houses will set the trend and then everyone else will follow. I think if the restaurants in the higher echelons of this country are doing the right thing and everyone sees that we're doing the right thing, not even necessarily the higher echelons, but the people that just care more. If the general public can see that the restaurants are prioritising, using these techniques, using suppliers that are using these techniques, then, in this age of mindfulness, people are going to be more mindful when they go to the supermarket about what they choose to spend their money on.
So it has to be about marketing the message.
A consumer, if you kind of care to do a bit of research and think to yourself, you might choose overall which restaurant you go and kind of give your good earned pound to, that hopefully that if they can tell you a little bit about how they source or how they grow for themselves, then you can make an informed decision. But I am also conscious, I think we shouldn't shun the good because they're not perfect. So because someone can't put organic over their restaurant or fully regenerative sourced, I am mindful always of that push and pull of, if people are doing good work, try and applaud that and support them. A small local restaurant in your area that does buy from their local farm and does get their dairy from places, they might not be able to give you a kind of a tick in the box name against that, but they are trying more than lots of other places, and we should reward that with our support.
They're exactly right in terms of what you said, but I suppose we kind of always try and summarise it as the under the bonnet stuff. I think having brands and also having people that you trust, I think building on that is so valuable. And if you trust any sort of brand, maybe these restaurants, everything they're going to try and to do is to put great food on the table, and supporting that is fantastic. And sometimes, we have it where we have lots of general public coming to the farm, and do I really want to get into detail about our mycelium in our soil? They don't care, and that's absolutely fine. Do we need to get into our fungal to bacterial ratio in our soil? No, because we might lose their interest. But showing them a real place and showing them a real value, listening to the bird song as you walk around the farm, I think that's much, much more powerful. And sort of the under the bonnet stuff, trust is a big thing. But going into regen, there is greenwashing and there is dangers out there. There's some regenerative sort of press talking about how we're regenerative because we're using 50% less glyphosate. And I think that's a pretty low bar personally, but also we can't let that stifle the energy. And we have to make the most of this movement because, as a farmer, an organic farmer, the resources that have been put into agriculture and organic agriculture. I went to probably the most conventional university possible, as in the Royal Agricultural University, and I was known as the organic boy. So our lecturer on fertilisation came from a representative from Nitram, and Nitram is the biggest fertiliser company in the world. So that was obviously skewed in the right direction. But anyway, it's a really positive direction, a real positive movement, and I think what my hope for regen going forward is it's outcome based. If we can measure outcomes, and there's so many tools that we have as farmers now to show outcomes. On our own farm, we have an ecologist coming around sort of once a month, measuring our skylark population, measuring our dung beetle population. What are the true outcomes? We're measuring the water that's coming off of our farm. We're measuring our soil carbon. We're measuring sort of trying to get into the areas of nutrient density. If all of our outcomes are positive and moving in a great direction, that's a really emotive story to be able to use for consumers. So regen is really exciting. There is greenwashing, but let's not just focus on that greenwashing, let's focus on the good that's coming out of it. And ultimately, we're all talking about agroecological systems here, which is a great word to summarise it all, and really wanted to prevent not throwing another name into the hat, but I think that encapsulates a lot of what we're trying to talk about.
And I think more and more now health is a priority for consumers, and you just have to walk down supermarket aisles and you're seeing health claims stamped on the backs of packs, high protein, high fibre. And I think people do care about this, and it is quite a big motivator. And I think bringing that back to farming systems actually does the food generated from regen and organic compared to conventional, is that higher in quality in terms of nutrient density, in terms of could that have a health benefit? And that's a really big question because, as Will's sort of alluded to outcome measures, a potential outcome measure, if we compared a carrot grown across different farming systems, and we could actually measure the nutrient density, so looking at the micronutrients and the polyphenols and phytochemicals in that carrot, and it's higher in organic and regen, which actually there is research out there which confirms this about I think sort of 30-40% more phytochemicals. So those are your polyphenols, those really good plant compounds that are great for health. In foods grown from organic and regen systems. And, looking at kind of dairy and beef, we've heard earlier about sort of omega-3s and all of that we know from these grass-based systems are richer and more favourable. So, and then I guess the next step would be, does this translate into kind of human trials, and are we seeing people healthier because of eating organic regen foods? And that's the really big question, and we need more research on this. And there's something there, but there's a lot of, I would say, debate in the nutritional community about this, and there's a lot of people who would still say that we just don't have enough evidence to suggest that it is healthier. But I think we're learning more and more all the time about this. And I know something at Yeo Valley, this is something we're quite passionate about and are looking to do more research in with universities around nutrient density. But yeah, there'll be much more of on this coming out. And it comes back ultimately, as well to say, to the soil and soil health and the microbiome in the soil, which is so important in this nutrient cycling. And so that's sort of the basis of a lot of it.
We'll come back to soil health, because I think that's fundamentally underneath all of this is almost the biggest issue we've got there. So I think we would have said as a panel that the regenerative movement is a really positive one. It's taking hold of a swathe of conventional farmers who would perhaps have used Roundup and glyphosate and fertilizers on a scale that are now moving towards it. Your danger as a consumer is that if you are conscious of chemicals going into your body from fertilizer or pesticides or insecticides, herbicides, then take care, because you can't be certain yet if somebody shouts a name, particularly some of the bigger brand names just going regenerative. Take care.
I think glyphosate is an interesting point, only that some people within regen, agriculture, I've heard some talks where people are preferring to use glyphosate rather than tilling, and that's the danger. If we're saying we're not disturbing the soil, then the other option is potentially using glyphosate. I saw an amazing talk from Nicole Masters where she said you earn the right to till the soil, and so regenerative isn't blanket like don't disturb the soil, but it's like make sure you're doing enough that then when you need to you can. And I thought that was a really nice way of kind of framing that, because I think one of the dangers of regenerative farming is that then people rely on glyphosate. And I don't know, Alice, whether you saw the paper recently that did show detrimental effect to human health from glyphosate?
Yeah, and I think there's, it's quite hard to research these kind of things, but in terms of impact of kind of pesticides, herbicides on health, there is some evidence out there around certain cancers, and you might hear about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma being a particular one, but it's not overly robust, but certainly there is something out there. And I think what is quite interesting, which I've heard more recently, or seen some things on, is around the gut microbiome, so the effect of pesticide residues on our own gut microbiomes, which kind of just makes sense, doesn't it? I think they're designed to be killing pests and weeds, and if we're ingesting residues, what kind of effect that could have on our own delicate microbiomes. So I think we'll see more to come on this. But just, I suppose, I would also like to add some perspective on it as well, that, with many of us in the UK, we're eating kind of 50 to 60% of ultra-processed foods in our diet. So if you are, I also think we need to be careful the way we have these conversations around different farming systems of food, because at the end of the day, if you are cooking from scratch, eating whole natural foods, whether it's from a conventional organic system, you're doing a really good thing. So just put that out there.
I don't know whether you're all aware that when a wheat crop matures and it's time to harvest, in conventional farming, and correct me if I've got this wrong, Will, glyphosate will be sprayed to kill the plant at that moment, because that's the perfect dried moment to get the best yield for bread or for processing of that wheat. Now that in itself is, so that thing has been killed at that moment, and other crops the same. Whereas with my spelt, and why would the farmer do that? You think, well, because it just means I can, on that day, rather than watch nature get through the rain, through whatever it is and do it, on that particular moment, that day, he wants to farm it. He wants it coming off because it's dry. That's the day he wants. And that's where man against nature, I think, and what you've heard a lot of today is about, we've got to let nature have the elasticity. And certainly as an organic farmer, I've been utterly frustrated in the early years. I can't harvest now, I can't do this, I can't do that, because I've got to wait for the weather. with conventional farming, often they don't need to wait for the weather because they can go that week earlier because they've hit that moment because glyphosate does it for them. So personally, I've got a real, no, don't use it, get rid of it, find another way. But as Will said earlier on, it's come out of a background of how on earth do we produce enough food for this country or any other country to survive? And we still haven't got there in any sense, I don't think, as to how to cope on that scale. But we'll come on to that in a minute because we're going to move on to UK food security in a second and just talk a bit around that. We've sort of said everything we can. Oh, we haven't done GM, have we? So just a quick last one on GM. So I add GM in because most of us don't fully understand it, and we're going to ask Will to talk a little bit about it in a minute. My understanding now is that the government is just passing or has passed the fact that you will be able to now buy a product that has been produced with GM involvement and you will never know because it won't be on the packaging, you won't have a clue that it's happened, but I'm just going to pass to Will now because Will will probably get that better than I have.
I suppose I inherited a pet subject of genetics from my grandmother who breeds cows. So I've been brought up with genetics and the importance of matching genes to your farming system. But I suppose genetic modification, gene editing is so far beyond our natural world with what we've just talked about here. But unfortunately, it's very well suited to sort of government systems of promoting technology in order to increase efficiency. It's another point of contract of control. And one thing that I think is quite scary is that genetic modification was really battered back by the consumer a number of years ago. And essentially what has happened, and there is scientific exactments of this, and I'm oversimplifying it, but it's had a fantastic run of remarketing. And they're calling it gene editing, so it's not the same process, but ultimately, to me, as a consumer, not just a farmer in that point of view, it's still really detrimental to the actual natural and nature, what we're supposed to do and our responsibility on this planet. We're not here to completely dominate and overrule nature. We're here to live with nature. And whenever we ever won that battle in the past, there's so many examples of super weeds, terrible, terrible things happening from genetic modification. Let's be really cautious about it going forward. So it is a bit of a slight call to action, as you call it. We, as consumers, we need to slightly push back on this. And that really needs to be at government level, unfortunately, because they've snuck it in.
So if any of you are working closely with your MP or want to, ask your MP what's happening. Because I think we all want to know what's in our products. And if it is a GM product, I would certainly like to know. And I think it's the knowledge of being able to make your decision that we're trying to talk about today. But we're then going to move on to the last subject in our arena, which is, well, where does our food come from? We've talked about the different methods of food production, and we're now going to cover what is it that we are eating in terms of where has it come from. We've talked about local, side by side, we've talked about growing food in Britain. None of us could quite remember our stats before I came in, so please do not rely on these stats. Xanthi particularly, do not take a note on this one because it won't be correct. But we think that we import something like 50 to 60% of all the food we produce, and I have done this before and I should know better, but anyway, a sizable amount of the food that we eat and buy is imported into this country. Lots of it because of seasonality. You can't grow a tomato at the moment outside in England. You can't actually grow a tomato outside in Spain either, I don't think, but they have lots of polytunnels to do it. So I found myself 2 days ago as a guest speaker at the British Tomato Growers Conference. I didn't even know there was a British Tomato Growers Association, but there is. And effectively, I learnt a huge amount during that one-day exercise. But the biggest thing of all was that industry, we eat 1 billion pounds of tomatoes in the UK. I couldn't believe it. And it is the biggest crop of anything, far more than berries or potatoes or anything else, which staggered me. Having said that, we produce in this country, largely in greenhouses and gigantic polytunnels, 160 million pounds worth of that. So if you think of that, that's 16% of our tomato production is coming from the UK. And then all sorts of other conversations about, so I said, well, yes, of course, but do our tomatoes taste as good as the Moroccan? Because surely they get more sun or whatever it was. And I was assured by all the seed makers and whatever it was that actually the taste is just as good here as it is there, and it's probably even better if you've grown it, as somebody asked, in your own garden, because you'll think it is even if it isn't. So through all of that, about 75%, I think, and it may be anywhere between 60 and 80% or 85% of our vegetables are imported into this country. And you think about that ahead, and you think of all the strife we've got around us, around the world at the moment, the uncertainty, globalization that I was used to with mulberries come right back into, we're afraid to almost go outside of our country, Brexit's happened and so on. So surely, if ever there was a moment, we should be looking and investing in how we're going to grow more food in this country. What's actually happened, the government has slapped inheritance tax on farmers. The average farmer, I'm told, or what was told by DEFRA, was 300 acres in the UK, and the average farmer made £30,000 profit. I haven't seen a farmer who has 300 acres who makes a £30,000 profit. There were grants available that gave that farmer £30,000, so now it's zero. Since then, we've had national insurance, we've had other things. I would think most farms are running at a loss. They might have a big capital asset, but that's now going to be attacked as well. So the farming world is in absolute, not retreat, but I think shock probably at the moment. And then we've had the driest summer we've had forever, which again has affected certain crops dramatically badly, others quite well. Where does that leave us in our journey to try and change that percentage with us going forward? The government and the last government and the government before have paid absolutely no attention to food. In fact, and in many ways you'd say really good, the environment has become the key thing to talk about. And farmers have received lots of small extra grants for hedge protection or water or doing trees, growing things. All good things, but all, I would suggest, sort of need to be behind food. If we have no food, we can't survive. And we are fast approaching a bit of a nightmare, I think. And for us to change as farmers, it takes about 5 to 10 years to really make that cycle change. If I'm going to come out, if 70% of our land, which I think is something like correct, is for growing animals or feeding animals, grass, not soy in this country, maize, all of that, if that was turned into, if we turn the maize crops for beef and dairy into, for example, corn on the cob for us, we can grow it surely, why couldn't we do that? There's a lot of changes could be made quite fast, but what would make a big difference was if the government would actually realise, unless it does something soon to support that change and bring investment into farming in the UK, we have got an absolute crisis coming. So what I would like to ask the panel, each in their own different ways, what would you do to help that scenario? Because you've got the farmer, you've got government, you've got the consumer, you've got the big retailers that are doing nothing to help us at all in that change. Have some fun. What would each of you do to make a difference? And this time I'll start to give Debbie a bit more time. Alice, with you at the far end.
Gosh, okay. So I'm probably going to come at this at a slightly different angle from, my background, but I think it's about, health. I think we're facing a massive health crisis. We're all very aware of that. And I think the solution to that, is what we eat and, going back to eating whole, natural, healthy foods, but also encouraging and giving kids and young people those skills to kind of do that at home. And I think this sort of also ties in a bit with the kind of outcome measures of, producing high quality, nutritious food, nutrient dense food as well. Because, globally we produce enough calories per person, but what are the quality of those calories? Vast majority coming from UPF. So I think for me, it comes from a health position. I think that's a really strong, we need to sit up and do something about this, the health crisis. And I think food. So
would you be approaching the schools, or where would you begin that journey?
I think it's a huge, it's a really good question. It's a big question, and I don't know if I've got the exact right answer. It's got to be probably a multi-system approach. I think education is really important, and catching, early on in education, school meals, I think, fundamental. But also even before that, I think when, young women during, pregnancy, we know that we talk about nutrition the first sort of 1,000 days of life, and that starts from conception, and that can have health implications. What we're eating, what pregnant women are eating, can have implications on kind of health of the baby, and that sort of goes down. So I think tackling it early on, and education, school meals, all really important.
Yeah, maybe I can be slightly negative to start off with, but a government that changes every 4 years would never be able to support a farming system. They could change in the way in which they support it, definitely, but when I'm planning ahead for our rotations organically, I'm looking 10, 20 years ahead. We're looking even further ahead to our next generations, and having that instability there is really, really dangerous. But then I'd like to sort of do a complete spin and say, well, actually, there's some really positive things. And in the UK, we have such a temperate climate. With global warming and climate change, there's weather extremes, and we do certainly get weather extremes. But unfortunately, and it's really sort of quite sad in a way, that the most affected areas are going to be the areas which are sort of hungry at the moment anyway. So actually, we have not just a responsibility for our own food security, but perhaps even wider. We need to probably produce more than what we will eat ourselves, because areas might be desertified. There's a sort of fact that got bounced around 5 years ago, which is kind of very concerning, that we only had 50 harvests left. That, if there's no a call to action bigger than that, I don't know what there is. And it does shock me sometimes that it isn't more talked about at the higher levels. But I'm going to stick to the farming and say that we can really add resilience with all these learnings. And my day-to-day is, how can I make my farming system more resilient to sort of external factors? Like we talked about the economics, but I actually almost think that the resilience to climate extremes is even more important. I mean, the health and welfare for me as a dairy farmer is 100% top of my priority every day I wake up. And it's really interesting when you talked about your cows being upset at the beginning, because I would not be here if my cows were upset, because I just wouldn't be here. And I think that's really important. But their health and welfare is top of our priority. But with climate change, heat stress is going to be a really big thing going forward. So we have a woodland pasture system, agroforestry, where we have trees and cattle integrated together. I think that offers a really exciting future potential. Does that exist in the current sort of standings? And there's a lot of red tape that could be involved in it, but that's a whole nother rabbit hole, and maybe not something to get into now. But with regenerative grazing and the herbal lays, we're trampling a lot of material, and we're looking after our soil. Big tick for us as organic farmers. But almost the unforeseen consequences after we kind of opened our minds was, because we're grazing these herbal lays, trampling a lot of material down, which is cycling and feeding the soil, is also creating a moist climate, and our soil is about 4 to 5 degrees cooler in our regeneratively grazed areas. So when our cows lie down, they're almost dissipating out their heat. That's nothing that we sort of went into regenerative grazing to find out. Gabe Brown says it, and I'd really recommend watching Common Ground. I think that really summarises it fantastically. I think it's available on Amazon Prime. But the biggest force for change that we have as farmers in our food system is what we've got going on between our ears. If you look at the universities and where we sort of currently get our education from, 65%, I think, in American universities is all funded by the agrochemical industry. So it's a no wonder we're in this situation now. Taking that step back and that agroecological look of observation, what's happening on my farm, how am I going to farm with my ecosystem rather than against it, that's my positive spin. Let's look to farm better.
Yeah, I mean, to take it back to the food security, I think, unfortunately, there's not one answer, right? No one's got the answer, otherwise I don't think we'd be sat here. We'd be doing more important jobs. But I think, to echo what you said at the end, Alice, is, education's a massive part of it. Especially like the young generation. Like, I've got young children now, and it's important for me on a micro level to teach them about where food comes from. So I think if it's built into the curriculums in school, I think every government minister could make a change, because we all need to eat, right? It touches, sports ministers, education, everything. We all need food to survive. So I think that should be put, like you say, more higher up the agenda than what it is doing, because we all need to eat, and we all need to eat healthily. Otherwise, because like a point that I was talking about before, when we were talking about the health benefits and things, like people in the industry can back me up here. In the last 10 years, the rise of dietary requirements has been noticeable for me, at least. I don't know, across the board of autoimmune diseases, like celiac diseases and intolerances, and that's no coincidence with the amount of chemicals and things that we're spraying on crops. So, I mean, I'm no scientist, but I just see what I'm seeing. We get a lot of the general public through our doors. We get cross-section of society, and the rise in people not being very well is very visible to me.
I'm going to yes and to all of those solutions. And my kind of take on it would be, so in a previous life I was a civil servant before I became a chef, basically. And so I will just kind of go down that route purely for kind of contrast to other solutions, because I think unfortunately for the powers that be in the global sense and in the kind of political of your own particular country, they are very driven by targets, and it can kind of galvanize and helpfully shackle people to certain behaviors. So if you look at the sort of on the climate change side of things, people actually kind of putting a target that we want to keep below, and then that's recognized or signed up to by lots of international players. It is not a perfect target because it will not drive all the perfect behaviours, and people will find ways of wiggling around and changing the boundaries and things like that. But what it does do is give people, consumers, members of the public, institutions, a kind of a stick to say, well, we're not on that track. So, I would find it interesting to say, would an international agreement of looking at each country being X% self-sufficient with their food supply, would it being a UK government saying we would like to do that if we think about I think everyone can kind of really understand energy security, and we can picture that in our mind, and we can kind of understand what that would mean, and we need to have sustainable supplies within the UK, and people can get that, but what would that look like from a food side of things to say we would want to be this secure, and that would mean X percentage of our food being grown and supplied then and staying within the UK. Unfortunately, targets sometimes you kind of have to whack people over the head with that to try and then mean that we trickle down to all these other behaviours that would have to happen and all these other changes that would have to happen in order to meet that. So it's a very boring and not a very good answer, because its targets are a bit naff, but it helps.
So I would gladly add to everybody else's excellent recommendations there and suggest education, of course. And perhaps education might need some defining parameters. So, for example, we could look at seasonality, we could look at what are we eating when, how has that sunshine been stored before we eat it, and ultimately how long is it from the soil to the plate. So some grain crops, I think, are perhaps multi-year from when they're harvested before they're turned into the flour that turns into the pasta that we serve for dinner tonight, for example. So we could start to educate more in that kind of realm of data. Secondly, sadly, we just don't live long enough. So our effects, our decision-making processes through farming take decades, if not centuries, before we start to see the ramifications of it. So sadly, either we can learn to live longer or we start to educate better. Really, my last thought on this is, what's on our plates tonight? What's on your plate tomorrow? Where did it come from? And what version of sunshine is that?
Wow, so many amazing thoughts and ideas. I don't really know what more to add. I guess something I'm kind of interested in is maybe reframing food security as food sovereignty. I think, we talk a lot about policy that supports systems that maybe don't serve us all as consumers that well. I think lots of people don't have time or money to connect with food and the way that it's grown, and potentially food in its most nutritious form. Like, it's brilliant. Rolling out education programs, and I think everything everyone said about education is so important, but it's also really important that people are able to access that education and then use it, because if you haven't got time to attend a class, or you haven't got the money to then go out and buy the ingredients, or you don't have the land, like a garden. I know you can grow things in a window box, but I think we have to look at this kind of how, I guess, the world today as a whole. I don't think that our food security or sovereignty is kind of standalone. I think it's so connected to economics and politics, and I don't really know what the answer is, but I think we have to make sure that whatever system we have serves everyone and not just people who can afford to connect with it.
So I suppose, how would I add or put that together as a message? I think education came out extremely strongly. Target if I could refine your target, we're pretty self-sufficient in cereal. We're not, but we sort of are. We're not too bad on dairy and beef and so on. The one that we are really bad on is fruit and veg. And if I was you, I would be going out and pushing really hard with your supermarkets and your whatever it is. Why can't I have more British fruit and veg? And how can we then, I suppose the next bit would be, we know we're in a government of disarray at the moment, despite its huge majority. It's not seeming to be able to do anything. It seems frozen in financial crisis, and therefore it is probably taking some of the actions which might be wrong towards farming and food. How on earth can we get them to change? Well, at the minute, the fourth minister went, as we say, shortly, a few weeks ago, got fired. The next one doesn't know whether they're doing, I think they came out of hoovers and washing machines and have gone into agriculture, but they wouldn't attend the tomato conference I've just been to because they were too frightened to get questions that would shoot them down before they knew what they were doing. So it means nobody's in control at the minute who knows what they're doing. But interesting, we did have the shadow minister for Food and Agric, which was Robbie somebody, can't remember his surname now, but he was extremely effective and he had come out of our background. And he was the first person I've heard as an MP probably in 10 years who actually really grasped the situation. And I'm taking up a dialogue with him to see what we can pull together that might be small wins that actually doesn't cost the government too much, but is it energy for food producers? Is it planning permission easier to put up greenhouses or whatever it might be? What are the things that could be done with so easily with no different effect? But if each of you went out and said, MP, I want to know what's happening to my food. Why are we not producing more? To me, that would be this trickle start to a change being made. Because with education, it's not just about educating children, it's educating us. How can we make that difference? So I think that's all we've got and done quite a lot on where we started from, on acid. So I've got 3 questions here, which is very good of you, not to delve just with more. The first one was, how can people growing produce in their own gardens in cities, I'm a Bristolian living in a polluted area, improve and enrich their produce or ensure their produce is grown better given pollution, poor soil, etc.? I'm going to give that one to David.
Of course, start with amending the soil with whatever organic, carbon-based materials that you can. Second of all would be to make sure that you're providing the most local seed source that you can, providing, of course, you can't reduce the pollution that's around you, and literally go for the how long it is from when it's ready to be harvested to how long it's on your plate, so you can get the maximum nutrition literally by plucking it from the soil, taking it inside, rinsing it off, and eating.
I mean, I think just grow, right? Just do it. Like, regardless of where you are and what you think the pollution's doing around the area, just even if you're growing a lettuce in a window box, that's better than not growing anything at all. And that lettuce that you're growing in the window box is going to be more nutritious than anything you buy in a supermarket.
Yeah.
So I would just implore people, even if it's like I say, a window box or a pot outside the back door, just grow something. If not just for yourself to see, the life cycle of things and, to appreciate what we eat by, growing it yourself, and ultimately it comes down to flavour for me always, and the flavour of something you've grown yourself, whether it's that story that we paint that that tomato in my granddad's greenhouse tastes the best tomato I've ever had, but it works, right? It tastes, you always follow flavour, so you follow what makes you feel good, and if you've grown a tomato that makes you feel good, then you're more likely to appreciate it.
And raised beds and adding compost rather than digging it all over, and if you've got a small area. Why is biodynamic farming more widely adopted in Europe, or looked at another way, why in the UK do we regard as weird? Well, I think I probably started that conversation off with my cow story, but I think my experience was when we started 20 years ago, it was a very small operation in the UK. I felt it established very strongly in Europe way back, didn't it? Why do we think it's not taken more hold in the UK? Is it because you're waving a horn round?
Well, personally, I mean, Steiner gave the lectures in Poland, so in Central Europe. And certainly there's a stronghold, particularly like my background is viticulture, so we see lots of producers in Austria.
So wine
Northern
is very
Italy.
strong, isn't it?
Yeah,
in
exactly.
Europe?
Austria, Northern Italy. But there's a lot in France too. But I think we're seeing more and more in the UK. And there's a guy called Robin who's not very far away, who has Limeburn Hill. Him and Georgina, his wife, have a biodynamic vineyard.
Do you want to just repeat that so whoever was listening can?
Yes, Robin and Georgina have a vineyard called Limeburn Hill, which is biodynamic. And Robin also teaches for the Biodynamic Agricultural College. And so if anyone wants to go and see biodynamics in action, you can go there. And I think he's really kind of leading the charge in the UK, and we're seeing more and more wine producers, I don't know about agricultural producers in the UK going biodynamic. And I think a lot of that actually is about building in that resilience, coming back to Will talking about these more extreme weathers, and we can grow grapes now because it's warmer, but we also see extreme weather here, so it's actually harder to grow grapes everywhere. But if you have a system that's resilient, then actually it's better than having to spend loads of money on sprays, basically. So I think in the UK, people are looking towards biodynamics, regenerative for growing grapes too.
Definitely resilience is really important. I think farmers are seeing the benefits of that resilience, and it's not just on their end yield, it's also about how consistently they yield it. But the other point I'd also just like to bring up is organic is only 2% of the market in the UK, so organic is also massively underrepresented in the UK, and I do get really excited about the regen movement because it's an emotive connection to the consumers. It's not just you cannot spray this and that's why it's good. It's this is doing better for you, and organic essentially is doing a lot of those things anyway, so perhaps we need to tap into that excitement. Then I'd also I'd hope to kind of talk about organic in a de-democratized sort of way, that we don't, I've always hated the association with these sort of agroecological processes with price premiums. I think that's really dangerous, and I know it's semantics, but I would say it's the value of that food. And if that value of that food to that consumer is recognised, then it's really captured. But I mean, it's way more than just the nutrition. It's the biodiversity that it's supporting, it's the air quality, it's the water quality, and it's the community too. So it's taking away those traditional metrics and saying, oh, it's organic, so we can charge a premium price. But has that just led to it not being adopted widely in the UK because it's too expensive? We need to address that.
So last question I've got here is, if it can take years for crops to go from farm to table, e.g. pasta, how much nutritional value does our food lose?
So I found myself getting into food and growing food initially in the conventional fashion as they taught me in college, and then all the way through to organic, all the way through to literally my own hands harvesting spinach in the morning and selling it at New York City Farmers Market that afternoon, and discovering and reading in some scientific white papers that have been put together that the nutritional content of that harvested fresh vegetable decreases rapidly. In the time since harvest on that particular study was measured in hours since harvest. So the real king of the hill production is to have a kind of old school family-based system where the family have grown the crops in the garden, they've picked them for dinner at lunchtime, they've taken them home, washed them and eaten them. And the other end of that spectrum really is in the ultra-processed foods, where something's harvested miles and miles away from where it's eaten, processed in all kinds of different ways. It's got phenomenal shelf life. It still looks, and even from my own perspective, tastes fantastic. But nutritionally, it's kind of dead food walking.
Except we should probably say that frozen is not that. So frozen.
I
is-
was going to come in on the frozen food actually. It's just as on a practical note, a really good option, especially for organic. It can be often cheaper, and frozen, berries, spinach, peas, all frozen very quickly after harvesting and locking in that nutrition. So I think that's a really good practical solution. Obviously not for everything, but I definitely myself use a lot more frozen food than I ever did. And easier to buy organic in some circumstances.
Yeah. Will's point about 2% of UK farm produce is organic. Organic sales in the UK have grown, I think, and are growing at the moment, but it's coming from organic produce from abroad, which is not good. So carbon footprint, etc. Carbon footprint is something we haven't really covered at all today, But just imagine whatever that percentage of food coming into the UK is, that carbon footprint is enormous. And I've got some stats somewhere which I'm not going to bore you with, but worth looking at. So thank you very much indeed for staying with us on what's quite a dry subject. I hope it's been of some help in defangalizing that thing. And thank you, panel, very much for all your information, which has been amazing.